Hi everyone, welcome to my studio again. My name is Diana Buitrago. I'm going to be sharing with you a demonstration of a value study that I did based on one of Velazquez paintings, the portrait of the sculptor Martinez Montañez. And this is going to be a demonstration um, basically on monochrome, so using only umber and white. But before I go ahead and share with you the demonstration, I want to first introduce everybody to um, the structure underneath the portrait and the planes of the head, because we have to give these planes a value, and we won't understand why is this value lighter than other one if we don't first imagine the light source and then know the planes of the head and their relationship to the light source. So I think it's fundamental to know first the structure and the landmark points of the skull, so that we can understand what's going on underneath our portrait. So here we go. Let's share some images first. What you see right here is the small value study demonstration that you will see after the presentation. I based the planes of the head that you see right here on the right on the John Vanderpoel's diagram that you can find in his book, The Human Figure by John Vanderpoel. I will make sure that there is a link to the book on the description below. And the value scale that I have up here is a completely neutral value scale if you have the Munsell color book. And that will give you the perfectly neutral chips that you can find, each number from 0 to 10 being 0 black and 10 white, and then from 1 to 9 a perfectly neutral gradation from dark to light. And I'm also going to link the book on the description below so you can take a look at both references. Now let's take a look at a skull view from the front. And we can identify right away some anatomical landmark points that are really useful, not only when we sketch and when we do a block in, because some of the measurements that we take are based on these anatomical landmark points, but we can identify and we can see easily if we know that these points are here to guide our blocking. Like for example, the halfway point, if you measure from the top, which is the top of the skull is the crown, and the bottom where you see these 2 points called the mental tubercles. The halfway point from top and bottom is going to be always where the lacrimal fossa is, or the tear duct. So that helps us to identify also the halfway point of a portrait when you have a model posed from you, or you are actually doing a master copy, right? So you want to always try to find that halfway point, because it gives us a lot of information. It's going to tell you where you're going to put the eye, where you're going to put that inside corner of the eye. And then from there, you can actually expand and find other points like the corner of the nose. Where is the corner of the nose in relationship to this first halfway point that you find? So from there, it's almost like a constellation of points that you can identify. Obviously, you need more than the halfway point to make sure you have a complete blocking. Another very important landmark point is the parietal eminences right here. These 2 points, you can see right away that those are also the widest points of the skull. In this drawing I did from the model, we can see that plane and this plane, there is a breaking point right here that we can identify as exactly this point. Although this portrait is a little bit more 3/4, it's definitely not a frontal pose. We can see the parietal eminence right here. We don't see it on the other side, right? But we can see, if we know that it exists on the skull, we know that even though there is hair and maybe it will be obscuring this side, we know that this is definitely a point that we can rely on to plumb. We can rely on to take the width measurement, for example. There's other points that we can rely, of course. So let me go ahead and continue explaining the landmark points. Going from top to bottom, these two bony protuberances right here, like that point and this point, you can see them a little bit better when you have the skull from a profile view. But these 2 points on the frontal bone, this is all the frontal bone right here, they're called the frontal eminences. So again, 2 bony protuberances on the frontal bone that indicates a change of plane right here from top plane to frontal plane. Right here, these 2 bony protuberances. And usually the quarters measurement, it lands around those points. Now going down this way, we have, of course, the brow ridge right here where the eyebrows they sit on. And then these 2 moments around the brow ridge, again, another bony protuberances. And right in the middle, this moment right here that is a little bit dark, is called the glabella. This area is very important because it indicates as well this nice subtle turn that exists from the frontal bone and where these bony protuberances will get a little bit more light at some point and gradually turning into the eye socket. You're always gonna have some kind of shadow around here, right? Underneath the eyebrow. That's because this is projecting forward these bony protuberances, and they're casting, the brow ridge is casting some shadow on the eye socket. So you'll see, like, for example, in the model right here, this whole thing is in shadow, right? So that's basically giving you the idea of, okay, that's all the eye socket. The eye inside the eye socket is partially in shadow because the eye should be inside the eye socket, almost like here, right? With all the eyelid and all that stuff. Now here you can see as well the other shadow shape that is indicating the brow ridge, glabella, eminences right here. You see that, and this whole shadow shape, which will be part of the eye socket. So it's definitely really nice to know what's going on underneath, because we can understand why is this shape this way or the other. Let's keep pointing out some anatomical landmark points. 2 zygomatic bones. The zygomatic bone is actually a conglomeration of 3 bones that form an arch. So when you tip the skull to see it from underneath, the zygomatic bone, it's basically it's arching from the side plane towards the frontal plane, and it's projecting forward. So this moment right here and that moment right here is projecting forward, and that's why sometimes, I mean, not all the time, from here to here, it creates a plane that tilts down because this is projecting forward. Obviously, depends on the model, how much how much meat it has on the cheek. Obviously, it's just all, sometimes it's a little bit flat, sometimes a little bit more round, but there's always that kind of like plane going, tilting down. Now, you can see a little bit of the indication of the zygomatic bone on the model as well. Now, going down this way, we have, of course, the maxilla and the mandible. And then in between that, we can identify the other quarter. So the other half of the half on the lower part of the skull. And that's also very important to identify because that gives us, for example, the indication of where the top of the upper lip will be. Sometimes the quarter lands around there. So we have a clue if it's closer to the upper lip, if it's closer to the bottom of the nose, or if it's closer to the corner of the mouth, etc. Another really important landmark point that I'm going to mention for portraits is going to be the pit of the neck. It is so important to understand where the pit of the neck is in relationship to our portrait. In this example of the model, I saw that the pit of the neck line up with the corner of the eye. So it gave me not only a stable point of reference, but also it gives me confidence to know that even though he moves, I know that that relationship exists. So if he moves, I won't go chasing the pose. So here's a 3/4 point of view of the skull, where you can see the plane changing from top to front, right where the frontal eminences are. We can still see the top and bottom where the mental tubercles line up, this time diagonal because of the direction of turning, the tilting of the skull. We can still see the parietal eminence right here. Now we're also seeing another landmark point that I want to mention on this 3/4 view, and it's called the temporal ridge. And this temporal ridge is really important because if you follow this line, I'm going to draw a line right now. If you follow the temporal ridge imaginary line all the way to the parietal eminence, and you make a straight line here and go down like that, you're basically making and giving yourself the idea of the side plane of the portrait. If I do this, that immediately gives you the idea of the frontal plane of the portrait. And then obviously this is going to be the top plane. So we're basically putting the portrait on a box. So again, there is another landmark point that give us and guide us to understand the planes of the head. This one is very important, the temporal ridge. Every time you see a temporal ridge, try to imagine that line and divide the portrait from side plane to frontal plane. And you can definitely see how the zygomatic bone, some part of zygomatic bone are actually part of the frontal plane, and some part of zygomatic bone are part of the side plane. Zygomatic bone is really particular. It has many directions. Some planes are pointing up, some planes are pointing more frontal, some planes down here are pointing down. There's definitely side plane, frontal plane, right? So zygomatic bone is going to have many directions. That's why it's so hard to sometimes render this area, and that you need to really slow down and render the form there, but really understand why is it turning back and why is it turning more frontal or more perpendicular to the light that is coming from above. So you know like which sides are going to be darker and which side you should be putting together into one same plane, all right? We can see other landmark points. We can definitely see other landmark points on the 3/4, like for example, the mastoid process. This part over here that you see, that's the ear hole. So the ear should be hanging around here. The mastoid process is always obscured by the ear. You know, when we have our model, when we see our model from 3/4 or frontal view, we actually don't see the mastoid process, but we know it's there. We actually see a little bit more of the mastoid process when we have a model that it doesn't have any hair, that has a shaved hair, and we see the model from behind. So that actually becomes a really important landmark point with the occipital protuberance as part of the back of this skull. But the mastoid process is nice to know that it's there because it actually helps us identify the direction of the muscles of the neck. The muscle of the neck, these two muscles right here, they're called the sternocleidomastoid muscles, actually connect the mastoid process with the clavicle. This is Velazquez portrait of Martinez Montañez that I based the demonstration you are about to see. But I want to put the skull next to the portrait so that you can see easily the relationship of the bony landmarks with this painting, the structure underneath this portrait, and give us the real feeling of the person. For example, all here, frontal eminences, you can definitely see that getting that very bright light, giving us the change right here of planes from top to frontal. Definitely, we can just follow the skull and then definitely have it as a reference for this portrait. We see the temporal ridge, and then that going down here, connecting to the parietal eminences, right? We see the glabella right here, that plane turning down, same way it's turning down here. Actually, I decided to leave this skull the same way of, or trying to make it very similar to the light situation on this portrait. Eminences right here, especially in this one, we can see how it's going from the eye socket dark towards the light. And we see that turn very nicely. The same way we see it here. We actually can definitely see this edge of the eye socket, giving us basically the contour of the nasal bone. The nasal bone is going to be receiving a little bit more light. So all this basically in shadow and obscured by, because it's part of the eye socket. The eye is getting a little bit of light, not too much. This moment right here is getting some light, right? So if we had like more meat in here, that would be part of this part. But all these, definitely all these planes are in shadow, which is definitely what's going on right here, that plane shadow. And then you see the tilt going down this way, which is definitely running from the zygomat all the way down to the edge of the jaw. So right here, we have this moment right here, the zygomat bone. Now in this side, we can definitely see also how the zygomat bone, we can definitely identify the bottom of the zygomat bone. We can identify the plane that is tilting a little bit more perpendicular to the light source, the plane that is turning down, right? So these planes, receiving a little bit more light, it's actually catching some highlight as well. I was saying that it's very nice how we can see the nasal bone in this portrait, right? It's just that. Right here, obviously, all the rest of the nose is cartilage. So there is beard, there is mustache, but we can see right away the bottom of the mandible. We can definitely identify the two edges of the mental tubercles right here in the bottom that you see these two moments right here. So there's a lot more to see and to identify in this portrait in relationship to the skull. So this is just a very quick approach. All right, now finally, planes of the head. So here is a diagram by George Bridgman. What I find great about the way he divides the planes, which is very similar to Vanderpoel as well, but I like to show you, I want to show you this, how he really think about the head as a solid, and he's always referring to this boxy construction of the human figure. Now, if you take a look at this diagram, and I'm going to show you right now the diagrams of John Vanderpoel, and it is very, very similar. The division is basically the same. So many schools have the same approach. Maybe the division is a bit different, but it's basically based on the same idea of the anatomical landmark points and the skull. So the difference is not very, very significant. Very quickly, just pointing out here is how he's dividing this plane based on the the moment where the zygomat is, and that projection of the zygomat towards the mouth, towards the mental tubercles right here in the bottom, and that zygomat going down and follow the structure of the jaw, right? And then if we see this side plane, we can definitely identify right here, my pointing with my pointer in red, the temporal ridge, right? So that temporal ridge following down, down, down this way, side plane. Frontal plane, all these. The frontal plane obviously has different direction, definitely. We already talked about the zygomat being really particular about how, change the planes right here from front to bottom. This plane is always projecting forward, usually receive a lot more light, but as that plane, depending on where the light is coming from, right? One is going to be more, catching more light than the other one, just like we saw in the portrait of Martinez Montañez. You can see how the frontal bone is divided by 1, 2, and 3 planes, right? And then the side plane. But the frontal bone right here, you can definitely check the frontal eminences. You can see it also here, a frontal plane and a plane that is tilting back, frontal eminences right here. You can definitely see the profile zygomat bone right here and how that plane all the way towards the mouth really project forward. Again, temporal ridge, side plane, parietal eminence right here, bottom plane underneath the jaw, the edge of the jaw, and underneath the plane of the jaw. That's always most of the time in shadow if the light is coming from above. That never gets that much light. Is usually getting some bounce light as a secondary light source. Now the frontal view of this diagram, again, I'm just giving you the anatomical landmark points. Frontal eminences right here. Here he is very particular in saying like that direction different from this direction, right? So frontal, top plane, but then the frontal is divided because it's almost like an arch tilting away. It's definitely not very flat. So we have 1, 2, and 3 planes. Then side plane, all that will be side plane as well as that. Projecting forward again from zygomat all the way to the mouth. That's projecting forward, catching more light. The nose has its own planar division, usually 2 sides and the top of the nose. Some people call that the roof of the nose. That would be the upper part of the nasal bone. And again, the plane tilting down here all the way to the 2 mental tubercles. So that's obviously changing direction. Now I hope that these 3 diagrams, this planar division of the head makes more sense when you understand the basic anatomical landmark points, because without them, you can't really know these. This is actually a diagram that I made based on Vanderpoel, and I use an acetate, which is a transparent piece of plastic sheet, and I use a micron pen so that I can juxtapose this sheet on top of a portrait that I need. So you can put it on top of the portrait of Martinez Montañez and see the division. I can put it on top of my self-portrait, and I can actually flip the image because it's transparent, so I can do that as well. It's definitely helping me a lot. I'm trying to make one for frontal view and one from profile. We can definitely see how all these planes are in shadow. All that very, very in shadow. And then identify how the edge of the core shadow runs along the plane and kind of like divides the light shape and the dark shape, right? So all this is definitely shadow. So this is basically telling me that I can follow this all that is shadow. So definitely these planes are getting more illuminating. Now that plane is turning less perpendicular to the light source, and that this plane right here is definitely turning towards the shadow. And then now this plane is definitely in shadow. This plane from the zygomatic all the way to the jaw, they're actually tilting down. We know that the planes are not receiving as much light as any of that. Even though it looks lighter, it could be part of an optical illusion. It can be part of the gray hair that we can see in him. So it's definitely not the real value of the plane. So we wanna make sure that we paint the value correctly, and then on top of that, we put all these accents of light gray hair or maybe a bounce light or things like that that will at the end represent this portrait. Now you're about to see the demonstration of this portrait. Make sure that you know exactly how the light source is coming in this direction. So, right, so the light source is pointing this way. The light source is going like that, definitely hitting a couple of planes more than others, and we can perceive the light effect. You can identify really a sphere or maybe an egg with its shadow here, the form shadow, and then how that is rolling all the way to the light most facing plane in all directions, remember? So we can see definitely the light effect in this portrait in a very abbreviated way. Now remember, value studies are supposed to be just studies. They're not supposed to get very finished, or they're not supposed to look like a finished little painting. This is very broad. It's based on planes, so it's based on the relationship of values on these planes of the head. All right, so after this, you definitely deserve to watch the video. I hope this was really helpful and you can understand the video and the demonstration a little bit better. Let's take a look at the demo. Okay, so here's the beginning of the demo. I really like to start my value studies not too tight on the drawing. Remember that these are going to be only a reference for the portrait. We don't really need to get any details in terms of eyes and features, for example. Not any details. So you just want to roughly sketch in the overall envelope and divide the darks and the light. So I'm using raw umber. I'm using a bristle brush that allows me to draw a little bit better than, for example, using a softer brush. And I'm going to paint on a cardboard surface that I like to use this kind of like very sketchy surfaces for studies, because that way I can always think about not being too precious about the studies. So keep in mind the values, keep in mind where is your light most facing plane, and have your diagrams around you, have a skull around you to guide the process. So if you are also forgetting which or all the planes that we were talking before, you can just go back and check on the video. Now raw umber is usually a value of 4, and then we have white. That's our value range from 4 to 10. Black is going to be value 1, so I'm not going to paint in black right now. Black is going to be reserved for the accents. So our value range is going to be very limited. It's going to be only going from 4 to 10. So I'll try to make one value in between raw umber and white. So I made that little bit of middle tone that you see, and just spread out and make a nice gradation on your palette, so you can always move your painting around, mix your tone on the palette, and then start painting. I always start with the background because it's good to have a context on this study. So if I get closer to the value in the background, then I can read the value next to it, which will be the shadow, and then I will definitely read the value that I will put for my line of spacing plane. And out of those three values, I can definitely, you know, start getting the relationship between the rest of the planes. All these values are going to be adjusted. You know, you have to start with something. You have to put on paint um, the best you can. Obviously, it's not going to be perfect at the beginning, but you the only way you get to little by little to finish the studies is by moving forward and trying to think about consciously where's the light coming from, where's my line of facing plane, which plane is going to be facing more directly to the light, which planes are actually turning away um, from the light. So depending on that, you'll give those planes a value. And I really apply everything more broadly at the beginning, trying to just establish the bigger relationships. And then little by little, I'll definitely break down those bigger planes. Now think about um, the hair being also another big shape that is divided by a plane that is receiving more light or not. So, think about the value of the hair in relationship to the value right next to the edge of the hair on the forehead, for example. So how dark is that plane of the hair and the value in relationship to the line of facing plane, and you get the value relationship between those two. But at the same time, you got to think about how light or dark is the hair in relationship to the background. So you have always like that kind of like triangulation and hierarchy of line mode facing plane and the darker end of your value range, which will be value 4, which we gave to the background. So it's always like relating your line mode facing plane with your dark, and so everything else will be very compressed right in the middle, gradually going from dark to light. Now, at this point, I'm going to start creating the value of the shadow. I know already where in the value range the shadow sits because the shadow is obviously darker than the line of facing plane, but it's also at the same time lighter than the background. So I do have a range and I know where around which value it's going to be. But there's not really a precise reason why I left. I left it to paint after I had established like facing plane and middle tones. Actually, doesn't really matter. You can definitely start with the shadow and then go towards the light, or totally the opposite from light to dark. Don't get confused by the hair on the mustache or the hair on the beard, the local of the hair. That's a gray hair, so the local is definitely lighter. But you have to think about where is this hair sitting on, where or what it's the plane of the hair, right, in relationship to the light. So sort of squint your eyes if you feel like it's too bright, or you feel like the value is distracting you too much. Squint and be a little optical, but at the same time, don't forget to be very conceptual about the um, the tilt of the plane in relationship to the light source. So for me, it's more important to get the overall value, and then, if I have to bring the hair a little bit lighter at the end as part of the as part of a detail, then I'll do it. But really, I just don't want to get too much detail in this value study. Now I'm really getting to develop some smaller planes, as long as I don't um, ruin my first initial light effect that I create by putting up these bigger planes in relationship to the light source. I can definitely break down those bigger planes to smaller without falling into making too many details, right? So you see me now also expanding my value range. That means, bringing my lights a little bit higher and lighter where I need. So higher in value. That means adding a little bit more white. And at the same time, bringing my value range all the way down to black, because in this portrait, the thing that he's wearing, that smock, it's really dark. I mean, it's darker than the background, so that's gonna be. And I have to push the value a little bit darker than Romber, and so I have to go down towards a value 1 or value 0 or 3 or 2, right? So right now I'm using Ivory Black for those darker and really, expanding my range. I'm also getting some details on the bottom planes of the shadow around the nose and on the corner of the mouth, but I can see some accents. So those accents, details, highlights, darker, all that comes after you create the bigger light effect. All right, so I really hope you guys enjoy this video, and that I hope it was also helpful to understand the planes of the head, the structure, and how to make a good value study. If you like the video, if you learned, make sure you subscribe to the channel. I'll be posting a lot more videos like these very soon. And yeah, definitely leave your comments below and let me know what you think. What would you like to see as well in the next tutorial? Again, thank you for watching. Like the video, subscribe, and share.